warm you all up by getting you riled up, getting you mad about how we were treated by the French during the War of 1812. Because we talk so much about the battle here, obviously, that's what the symposium is about, but the battle is part of a much larger war, and that war didn't take place in this hermetically sealed environment where there's just two belligerents, Great Britain and the United States. Okay, like most wars, the War of 1812 is a multiplayer event. And the biggest silent partner, the most important one, during this conflict is, of course, Napoleonic France. So by the time I've got today, I wanted to look at French involvement in the War of 1812 and in the build-up to that War of 1812. And then by doing that, we can kind of put the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans into this larger geopolitical context. So, to begin, I thought I'd start with this cartoon. Okay, it's a cartoon that comes from Gilray, famous London political cartoonist, in 1805. And it's interesting because it sums up the power dynamic of the day, which is the two superpowers, Britain and France, carving up the plum pudding of the world between them. Now, if you can see that world, where is the United States? Not there, right? Non-existent. Okay? And that really gives you a good indication of just how much Britain and France are really thinking about the US during this period. And even though the United States thought much more highly of itself, that really is kind of the source of much of the problems here. So this really does sum up the situation quite well. So keep that in mind as we're talking about how the French will be treating us throughout this conflict. Now, I think it's pretty safe to say that without the Napoleonic Wars, which went from 1803 to 1815, there probably would not have been a War of 1812. Now, you can argue that the Jeffersonian push for trying to take Canada and gain more territory could have been a cause for war. However, the preconditions that are there because of the Napoleonic conflict are really going to be instrumental in stirring up a lot of the tensions that will lead to war and provide an environment in which France, A, is able to treat us very badly. They will act very duplicitously throughout the build-up to and during the actual war itself when it comes to dealing with the US. And it really gives them the opportunity to be the agents provocateurs, the stirrers of the pot of tensions between the United States and Great Britain that will only help French interests in the larger war that's going on in Europe. So that's what we're going to do. Now, we all know that the Jeffersonian government was quite sympathetic to France. I mean, Jefferson is always going to be more Francophile than he is Anglophile. And this is a Federalist cartoon that comes to us from the lead-up period to the War of 1812. The Federalist eagle is here attacking Jefferson, who's about to burn the Constitution on the pyre of French despotism. So you can see there's a lot of contention, even within the United States, about how we see our relationship with France versus our relationship with England. Now, while Jefferson might have been more staunchly leaning French than any of his other contemporaries, I think by the time we get to Madison's presidency, Madison is going to still be Francophile in his leanings, but a little bit more pragmatic, a little bit more realistic in how he sees us in terms of their view. And that will certainly color a lot of his movements. Now, how did Napoleon look at the United States and look at Americans? Well, first and foremost, I think you can sum up this whole opinion that he holds of us in one word from reading his correspondence and looking at his letters, and that is disdain. He sees Americans as British. They are barely one generation removed from actual Britons, and to him that means they cannot be trusted. And when you look at the large body of British traders, the Federalist merchants, especially those operating from New England, many of them are actually English or have connections directly to England, and therefore their trading interests, as far as Napoleon understands, are going to lean much more towards an alliance with Britain. And then you have the fact that Napoleon knows, just like most people over here know, that most of the sailors on board American trading vessels are British, and therefore will be subject to impressment from the Royal Navy. Now that is a problem for Napoleon, because his great bête noire in this whole war is the Royal Navy. And impressment is a source of their strength. He's not worried about the British Army at this point. They're fairly weak. It's the Navy that he's got a problem with, especially after 1805. Now, this whole idea of impressment relates to a series of laws that are known as maritime belligerent laws. Okay, now, they're not just claimed by Britain. Okay? Now, Britain might have a monopoly on the idea of impressment, but every naval nation of Europe during wartime is claiming some kind of law like this. And the ones that are really important here are the second two. The idea that you can stop and search neutral vessels, neutral trading vessels, and if it's determined that those neutral vessels are carrying goods and services to the enemy or have traded with the enemy, then you can seize that ship. Seize the ship, take the cargo, and do what you will with the crew. Now, Britain certainly does this, but so does France. Throughout the lead up to, and especially during the actual War of 1812, they prey upon American merchant shipping equally, if not more, than the British do. So that they're very guilty in this respect. As far as how Napoleon sees the United States in this light, he sees our military and naval strength as absolutely insanely weak. Okay, yes, we had a few nice frigates that did a pretty good job during the Barbary Wars, but Jefferson has made quite clear his intention to beach those frigates and to slash naval building programs. He's also going to cut the army down to about 2/5 of its size. Now, to a military dictator, this is absurd. Why would you do this? And what it also tells Napoleon is that American trading vessels coming across the Atlantic are going to be absolutely vulnerable to attack. There will be no military escorts, no naval escorts protecting them on their passage. So he can do with them as he sees fit, as far as he's concerned. He will infringe upon US freedom of the seas that we were claiming. He'll ignore our claims of sovereignty for neutral vessels. And he'll do exactly what he wants. And part of the reason he feels he can do this is that the government of the United States, to someone who is an imperial dictator, is absurd. I mean, the whole idea of a democratic republic to him is inherently weak. And so while he has very little respect for our system of government, he's also wondering whether it's even going to last very long. So no respect to the forthcoming from Napoleon in this regard. Now, we did make one concession to the United States on a diplomatic level, and that was he allowed the US Navy in its times of war to use French ports to condemn and sell prize vessels. Now, this was really important. Doesn't sound like much, but what it meant was that because the US didn't have territories all over the world, if our Navy was to actually use prize captures as an effective means of war, we had to be able to take them somewhere quickly and get rid of them. And French ports in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic would be incredibly necessary if that were to come to pass. Now, this is a unique privilege. Napoleon doesn't grant this privilege to any other country that I've been able to find anyway. And he expects something for it. It's not free. What he expects is that we will stop trading with Great Britain and be exclusively on the side of France in exchange for this great gift that he's given us. And when that doesn't happen, well, he gets kind of upset. Now, in terms of the men who are there working for Napoleon as the ministers, foreign ministers in France who have to deal with the American consulates on the ground, there are two primary ones that I'll talk about today. The first you've probably heard of, Charles-Maurice Talleyrand. And Talleyrand is an interesting character, to say the least. He's incredibly ambitious. He is very forthright in his belief on how things should be done. He likes to do things his own way. Now, that is a problem when you're up against Napoleon Bonaparte. He likes to do it the same way. And they will have a big falling out. Essentially, Talleyrand will be fired in 1807 because he doesn't see eye to eye. Now, he'll be back. He'll be back with the Bourbon Restoration in 1814, but he's gone for the time being. Napoleon will replace him with the Duc de Cador, someone who's much more malleable, much more willing to do the emperor's bidding. And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about Cador. He's there from 1807 to 1811. We'll talk about him a bit more in a while. Now, our men on the ground in Paris we had 3 of them during the period. Now, the longest lived, or longest in the role, was John Armstrong. He's there from 1804 to 1810. Now, Armstrong was a bit of a player, political player. He had been a military man, had served during the Revolutionary Wars, and he'll be recalled in 1810 to come and serve the Madison administration. He's going to actually serve sort of as a minister for war, and he'll fight in the War of 1812 when it happens. He'll be replaced by Joel Barlow. Now, poor old Barlow, he is an incurable romantic. He's an optimist in a very Voltairean sense. Okay? He's a poet, he's a humanist. He believes in the Franco-American Old Alliance, that there is a connection there, and that of course France is going to come to our aid. And he will be very sorely disappointed and will actually die in this office as he's trying to get a meeting with Napoleon as Napoleon is retreating from Russia. He goes out to the eastern frontier area, gets pneumonia, and actually dies. He freezes to death. He'll be replaced by William Henry Crawford, completely different stripe of a man. Crawford is a lawyer, he's a politician, he served as a senator, and he's a real pragmatist. He is not, for 1 minute, happy about the treatment that the United States is getting, and he's willing to call them out on it too. He sees it exactly for what it is, and we'll look at some of his correspondence in a bit. All right, so all of this tension really ramps up starting in 1806, and I call this the period of the War of Decrees because the three players here, Britain, United States, and France, all start laying down this series of laws which are really going to elevate all of the tensions in the regions. The first move is the Berlin Decree. Okay, this is Napoleon's opening salvo in what he called his continental system. And what that is it's a war on trade against Great Britain. Think about the fact in 1806, he has just, by the end of 1806, he's subdued Prussia. He has had astounding victories at Jena and Auerstadt. He's crushed his Prussian rivals, and he's in control of most of Western Europe, or at least has other countries allied to him. So this is his moment because he hasn't been able to subdue the British. Okay, they're still out there, they are still dangerous. And so he's going to try a different tack with them, not a military one. Go at them and hurt them where it counts, with their trade. To a nation of shopkeepers, as he called Britons, this is going to be really rough. If he can cut off their source of markets, for imports and exports. So what he's going to do is put this cordon sanitaire around all of French territory and French allied territory and say, look, none of you can trade with Great Britain. No imports, no exports, nothing. And what he's trying to do here is just bring Britain to her knees in a more protracted way, but do it financially. Now, of course, the big loser in this equation really is going to be the United States as one of the largest neutral traders who is working with France and Great Britain. So we are really going to be hurt by this situation. In the same year, 1806, Jefferson is also going to put down his own foot on the issue of British trade. He is getting upset about the attacks on American neutral shipping, getting upset about the issue of impressment, and I happen to agree with Mr. Humans on impressment. It's a paper tiger for war, okay? But nonetheless, it's an emotional one. Okay? He's able to stir up a lot of people to get behind him on this issue. So he lays down the Non-Importation Act. This says to Britain, no more, you cannot import anything to us. We are going to punish you for preying on our merchant shipping. Well, the British respond in their own way. In 1807, just a few months after the Berlin Decree goes down, they release the Order in Council in 1807. And this is a war on trade against, effectively, both America and France. Okay, it's directed mainly at France. It bans neutrals from trading with France. Those neutrals, of course, are mainly the United States. So the British are making a salvo here at both of its attackers. Later in 1807, Napoleon's back. He's going to double down on the Berlin Decree with the Milan Decree. And this is aimed also at neutral shippers. This tells neutral vessels favoring Britain that they are now subject to seizure. It completely violates any previous treaties that France had with the United States about leaving their trading alone. And it sets up a situation in which everyone is now preying on the poor old American meat in the trading sandwich. Okay, we are really in dire straits at this point. By 1807, remember, Russia is lost as an ally. Okay, they've been defeated at the battles of Eylau and Friedland. Treaty of Tilsit has come down, and now Tsar Alexander and Napoleon are mates. Okay, so all Britain's got left to her is to wage this really, really aggressive maritime war. And that's what's going to happen. And of course, it's the United States who gets pretty much beat up in all of this wrangling. And this is a cartoon from the time which I think sums it up really well. Here's Jefferson being attacked by the highwaymen of Britain and France, who are ready to club him into submission and rob him blind at the same time. And what he says is, what an enmity to pull my coat on the highway of all nations on the seas. Okay, that's where the problem is lying. That's really what this War of 1812 is largely about. Now, 1807 is also a pretty rough year for the United States Navy. There's this infamous incident that happens in June, known as the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. And this is a time when the HMS Leopard is looking for Royal Navy deserters. They come across the USS Chesapeake, they fire a warning shot, asking her to heave to so they can board her and look for their deserters. Chesapeake doesn't obey, so the Leopard opens fire. And in the process, she kills and wounds 16 American sailors. The Chesapeake heaves to, they go aboard, they get 4 of the deserters they were looking for, and they really were Royal Navy deserters. They are well documented as such. But to the United States, this is an act of war, firing upon a US Navy vessel. And it stirs up all those issues, again, over impressment. Okay? It allows the Republican administration to really use this as a call to war among its citizens. Now, 1807, Jefferson's also going to fight back with legislative measures. The Embargo Act of 1807 is his next volley in all of this, but it's a crazy one. It shuts down all trade. No trade, no exportation for American traders. Okay, kind of nuts when you think about it. Now, he thought it was a good idea. Many did not. There's one congressman who says that this is a cure for corns by cutting off the toes. Okay. Albert Gallatin at the Treasury watches the export value from the United States drop from 1807, from $108 million down to $22 million the following year, and it continues to fall. It is a very drastic measure. And of course, the New England Federalists, where most of the blue water trading is coming from, go absolutely bonkers. This is a Federalist cartoon from 1808, 1 year into the Embargo Act. And here's the Federalist carrying his goods, trying to get them down to the water so that they can be loaded onto British ships. And the "oh grab me" has got in. Oh, that cursed "oh grab me." Of course, that's just embargo spelled backwards. Okay. Now, the British had a take on this too. This is also a cartoon about the Embargo Act, also from 1808. And here you have Jefferson in the middle, talking to a group of New England merchants and saying, look, all we have to do is maintain this Embargo Act for 15, maybe 20 years, and Britain and France will fall at our feet. And the traders are looking at him going, well, how do I dispose of my produce? My warehouses are full. My ships are at the dock. My family are starving. But to the British, there's another actor here, and that, of course, is Napoleon, standing behind Jefferson, whispering in his ear that you two shall be king hereafter. So as far as the British are concerned, they are very worried about this relationship, this alliance that is taking place between the United States and France and the effects of it. Well, not to have to tell you and make any spoilers here, but the Embargo Act is a total disaster. Britain and France don't feel the effects, at least not in any kind of short-term way, and Jefferson, right before he leaves office in 1809, is forced to repeal it. Now, Madison comes along and replaces it with, it's almost like a save-face kind of a measure, and replaces it with the Non-Intercourse Act. And this says, look, we'll reopen trade with everyone but Britain and France. Now, that's still problematic because those are our two largest trading partners. So still financially, the United States is wrecked and is continuing to be wrecked in this build-up to the war. Now, 1810, the Speaker of the House, Nathaniel Macon, comes along with an idea, a compromise on how we can make this actually work. And what he says is, look, if we make an offer and we say, we'll open up trade with Britain and France, but the first nation to stop preying on US shipping, we will stop trading with the other one. So whoever wants to be our friend first, we'll go in, boots and all, to support you. Now, that offer is taken up by Napoleon's government, sort of. Okay. Napoleon sees an opportunity here to be very naughty. And what he does is he instructs the Duc de Cador to go to the Americans and say, yep, we accept your offer. We accept Macon's bill. But here's the conditions. Number one, you have to shut the British out of US trade, which was part of the precondition anyway. But two, the British have to break through, the Americans have to break through the British blockade of French ports. Now, that is an act of war. That is very dangerous. So the French will take us up on our offer if we agree to make war against Great Britain. So here, back in 1810, they are directly stirring that pot, directly trying to get that outcome. Okay? They'll rescind the Berlin and Milan decrees if we do this. Now, Napoleon, of course, had no intention of following up on his promise. No intention whatsoever. He'll continue to prey on American shipping, he'll continue ignoring our sovereignty, and continue to stir up tensions. Useful as a distraction, take away his greatest rival at sea. This is a cartoon from Philadelphia in 1813, and I think it really sums up American understanding of the awkward position that we've been put in. Here is Columbia addressing very angrily both John Bull on the far right, Britain, and Napoleon. And what she says is, I tell you, Johnny, you must learn to read respect, free trade, seaman's rights, and as for you, Monsieur Beau Napoli, when John gets his lessons by heart, I'll teach you respect and retribution. And John Bull says, well, I don't like that lesson, I'll read this one instead. And he's got a pamphlet that says, power constitutes right. And then in the middle is Napoleon, who says, ha ha, beg of me be glad to see Madame Columbia angry with that dear Bull. But me no learn respect, me no learn retribution, me be the grand emperor. I don't know why Napoleon has to talk like Jar Jar Binks, but there you have it. But it's an effective understanding of the position that we've been put in and just what these other two sides are doing to our trade. But why? Think about it. Napoleon has his hands full with a few other things. Okay. By 1807, he is beginning his peninsular campaign against first Portugal and then Spain. And then he's going to move on to Russia by the time we get to 1812. Now, in Spain, he has a much harder time than he ever dreamed. Napoleon believed he would walk into Spain and that the people would welcome him with open arms. Now, the Spanish monarchy might fall fairly quickly. It's a fairly weak monarchy, but the people do not. And what erupts is years of just vicious, horrific fighting, guerrilla warfare. This is where the word is born, the little war. It starts here, okay? He's going to be up against the Duke of Wellington and the Portuguese allies, and this war is going to drag on until late 1813, even a little bit into 1814. It is going to be Napoleon's most costly adventure in terms of time and money and the investment that he has to make there. And then, of course, there's this. So he begins his Russia campaign on the 24th of June, 1812, just a week after we declare war on Britain. He'll start with about 700,000 men, almost 700,000 men total. By the time he has made it through his first encounters at Vilnius and Smolensk and on to Borodino, he is in deep trouble. He has lost hundreds of thousands of men, not just to battle, mainly to disease, terrible diseases like dysentery and typhus, and they are dropping like flies. I don't know how many of you have seen this. This is the wonderful Minard map. This is by Charles Minard from the end of the 19th century, and it's a physical map of the Russia campaign. The red line is going from the start of the Niemen River into Moscow through Vilnius, Smolensk, here's Borodino up here. But the width of the red line is representative of how many men he's got. If you have a really scaled one, it's 1 millimeter for every 10,000 men. And you can see how that line diminishes. By the time he gets to Moscow, he's working with about 1/3, maybe 1/4 of the men that he started with. The black line is the retreat from Moscow. You can see how quickly that diminishes almost to nothing by the time he's back to the Niemen River. When he's at the Berezina here, at Studianka, he is facing temperatures of -20 degrees. And those temperatures are going to continue to fall down to -36 degrees Fahrenheit on the march out. So that's what he's facing from June to December of 1812. Clearly, his mind is not on the United States. It's pretty drastic stuff. By the end of this campaign, keep in mind too, overall, the Grande Armée is looking at about 17% of its original strength before the start of the Russia campaign. Absolutely devastating in terms of manpower. Now, June of 1812, we declare war on Great Britain, and there's a fairly strident historical debate about just how much Madison actually really considered declaring war on France too. He understood they were preying on ships ferociously, American ships. Now, there's correspondence. We know he was thinking about it. He wrote to Jefferson as much. But the response that comes from Jefferson, I think, pretty much sums up how Madison was feeling anyway, that that would be a really bad idea. First of all, we're now in a state of war. We need those French ports for it to make our navy useful. And why would you declare war on the two superpowers of Europe at the same time? It's just not a great idea. Now, Crawford, our consul on the ground in France, is very cognizant of the fact that we are going to get no support from Napoleon's regime. What he says in a letter back to Jefferson is certainly nothing like sympathy for the United States was manifested in any European cabinet. They are all under the thumb of Napoleon's regime. And the French are going to continue to prey on US shipping and especially the US shipping that tries to get out from New England and bring vast amounts of wheat and flour, tobacco and other commodities over to Wellington's armies in Portugal and Spain. Okay? They are violating this continental system. Like by 1810, it had pretty much broken down anyway. However, these ships are fair game, and the French frigates, when they can break the blockade, they go out and they burn American shipping to the waterline. And they imprison the crews as a means of keeping them out of impressment, out of the hands of the Royal Navy. Nothing that would strengthen or embolden the Royal Navy can be allowed to happen. So pretty aggressive stuff on the part of the French. But by 1814, Napoleon's game is pretty much over. The Austrian, Russian, Prussian coalition defeats his armies at the Battle of Paris at the end of March 1814. By middle of April, he's abdicated and he's on his way to Elba. Now, Ron scooped me on my image of the exile, so I had to grab this one. But it's still a pretty good one. I love the crows flying over his head as he sits looking longingly back to Europe. And it's really interesting to read Crawford's opinions of this abdication. He is no fan of Napoleon Bonaparte. He calls him obstinate and arrogant. And so he actually writes a letter to Jefferson that says, I think the demise of Napoleon might actually be a good thing for the US, but just not right now. Because what he knew he was facing was that Britain owned the Allies. Okay? They were absolutely in charge of the Congress of Vienna, and they could stop any other allies, any other of Britain's allies, from doing anything to help the United States, especially providing loans. The Dutch were forbidden to help the US by their British allies. He knew that Britain could now focus its military effort, its army, its navy, on the fight that was happening in North America. And he knew that Louis XVIII, the restored Bourbon king, was absolutely useless because he was a British puppet. Effectively, the British had come back and managed his restoration. Now, Talleyrand also comes back with Louis XVIII. And there was no love lost by Crawford for Talleyrand at this point either. What he writes is that he says, Talleyrand was a man governed solely by his pecuniary interests, who was ripe for the taking by Britain, which after bribing all of Europe will not grudge what will be necessary to bribe a minister who's notoriously venal. He's got some great letters. He's terrific. And he's also aware, like most Europeans were, of the fact that this weak Bourbon king was probably not going to last very long, and that a humiliated France is ripe for the return of Napoleon Bonaparte. And this is actually a French cartoon of the era, but they're kind of hard to come by. But it shows just Napoleon over here, temperate, getting work done, efficient, effective, getting things happening. Whereas Louis XVIII is here just strictly worried about his gut, his ever-growing gut and his gouty feet, and absorbed by himself. A very ineffective ruler for France. And of course, this is part of the reason why a lot of reinforcements are not sent to North America. About a total of 30,000 men come across, even after the abdication, but they are divided between Canada and Prevost's army, between the Chesapeake and between New Orleans. So they're really not getting the kind of reinforcements that were expected by the United States, at least. And during the Battle of New Orleans, we, of course, feel the effects. So in a final analysis, we are not treated well by France at all. Napoleon handles us very roughly, bullies the US throughout this period, considers US professions of an allegiance as insincere, because ultimately we're Britons after all. Okay? He reneges on agreement after agreement, especially the Cador Agreement. He preys upon US shipping even during the War of 1812, and we need those revenues. He ignores US sovereignty claims, and he stirs up anything he can to push war with Great Britain and America as a distraction to help the French war effort. So what are the consequences of all this? Well, ultimately, they're actually really damaging to to the Franco-American alliance in a very long-lasting way. But for the short term, the fizzling out of diplomatic relations here allows the next president, Monroe, to actually start dealing with the Spanish. And this gives us a very important treaty in 1819, Adams-Onis Treaty. And in this treaty, the Spanish give us Florida in exchange for maintaining control of Texas. And why is that important? Well, we had claimed that Texas was part of the Louisiana Purchase for a while, and we kind of decided to give up on that. But France was claiming Texas. They were going back to old LaSalle claims from the end of the 17th century. Okay, but by doing this, by saying, no, Texas is now Spanish territory, we could effectively push France out of all of North America. So it was an effective tool at that time to get what we wanted. Now the tensions remain high. The relationship becomes even more acrimonious once we get to the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Because the first thing he does is tell France that he's going to demand reparations for all the depredations that France committed on the US shipping during the War of 1812. And the French respond by going, no. And if that's the way you want to be, we will sever all diplomatic ties. And that's what they do. And it remains in that situation for some time until Alexis de Tocqueville comes to the US. He makes his travels through the mid-1830s, writes his discourses, and then he starts to broker a reopening of diplomatic ties in the mid-1940s under Napoleon III's regime. But it's an uncomfortable kind of alliance. It doesn't actually really improve until Napoleon III is gone in 1870, at the start of the Franco-Prussian Wars. And then there's this. The French give us a gift in 1886, but it's actually not a gift from the French government. It's a private gift to the American people, a symbol of our embracing of anti-slavery and of freedom in general. Okay? And really, relations are not going to improve between the United States and France until we get to World War I. So that's almost a century of animosity that can be directly linked back to the bad handling that Napoleon gave us in the War of 1812. Thank you.